Welcome back. I'm Alfred Lambremont Weber, and today we have, in many ways, a somber moment, but a very deep moment, because today is the anniversary. Well, it's not the exact date. Today's August 7th, but August 6th and August 20th, I believe, the anniversaries of, in our time, uh, the first, quote, nuclear bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And independent scientist Leuren Moret, who's coming to us from Berkeley, California, will be presenting scientific facts about and historical facts about the event and exposing who was behind that and why. Leuren,
Yes.
you and I have traveled and have lectured in Japan, in Okinawa. I see that you're wearing a very beautiful uh, kimono. Perhaps you like to tell us a bit about it. What is the purpose of today's program? Why are you bringing us this somber memorial and expose today?
Well, in the year 2000, I was invited to Japan to speak at the plenary session of the annual Hiroshima and Nagasaki memorial events. And that was such a profoundly disturbing and changing and very powerful experience for me. um, and also the solemnity and the deep spirituality that I experienced there as a participant and honored by many, many people. It changed my life. And I decided to dedicate the rest of my life to the nuclear issue because I'm a scientist and because I'm a woman. And uh, I wanted to educate the public, the media, the citizenry, the parliaments. And I never dreamed in a million years that I would do the things that I have been blessed with being able to do in terms of many, many things surrounding the nuclear issue. And so I also was able to apologize to the Japanese people for the horrific events that happened in World War II. The first atomic bombing of a population in the history of the world, and it was conducted illegally, immorally, and inhumanely against a population that should never have suffered an event like this. And over the years since 2000, when I went to Japan for the first time, I have uh, done a lot of research and traveled a lot and discovered in these travels and in my research that the Western economy is completely based since World War II on nuclear technologies that produce nuclear pollution and are causing the depopulation of the entire planet, the whole biosphere, every living thing, alteration of the DNA of the entire planet, and I just cannot stand by and not say anything. This is a profoundly life-changing event or series of events that are doing terrible harm to the biosphere and everything living in it. Um, it's just not sustainable for one country or a few superpower countries with these horrendous nuclear weapons and nuclear technologies to destroy all living things. And I'm talking about in less than 75 years, there's been a very profound change in the DNA and the genetic future of many living things that have been exposed to nuclear pollution. And it is a deliberate agenda of depopulating this planet, and it must stop. And the citizens of the world are the only ones who can stop it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Now, as you mentioned, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the first nuclear atomic bombings, and you'll be bringing us all the facts and exposing them. You wanted to start with a quote from Yoshito Matsushige.
Yes.
The immediate cover-up.
Yes.
Surrounding.
Yes.
And so perhaps you'd like to start there.
This is from a book called At Work in the Field of the Bombs. It's an excellent, excellent book. You can get it used on Amazon, and it's by Robert Del Tredici. This was an interview with Yoshito Matsushige. He was a photographer in Hiroshima when that event, bombing event, happened. And I'd like to read a short paragraph on his impression or his dialogue on how it affected him. So the author said, "What happened? What did you see from your house?" And he said, "Oh, and he worked for the Shugoku Shimbun in Hiroshima, which is a newspaper that books and did a lot of research on this horrific event, and also around the world, the later expressions of the same thing." So he said, "At first I saw something shining and sparkling. It was kind of a twinkling of lights, like you see from a sparkling electric live wire. That would be the initial pulse of a nuclear event. The next instant, there was this huge white flash. That is the secondary pulse, like a giant magnesium flash bulb. I couldn't see anything anymore after that. Then I heard a blast, and when the blast hit, my body jumped in the air about a meter, and I was thrown against the wall. My wife cried, 'Bombing!' and ran to me. I grabbed her hand, and we both got out of the house. We crossed the streetcar tracks and went out into the field across the street. I thought the bomb had landed right on my house. I went into the field holding my wife's hand, but I couldn't face because of the blast and the uranium dust. Everywhere there was dust. It made a grayish darkness over everything, but I could feel the warmth of my wife's hand. And it was this that made me realize she was still alive, and also that I was still alive." And then I just like to read a description of the fact that the Japanese knew in the security agencies and in the army, they knew ahead of time that there was a new horrific bomb that the US had. So the author asks him, "Were you thinking at all about the kind of bomb that had caused such destruction?" And Yoshito responds, "I guess it had not been an ordinary bomb. At Army headquarters, I would sometimes hear secret information. And one time, a rumor was going around that there existed bombs the size of matchboxes, which could destroy large buildings. I thought the bomb must have been not exactly the same, but something like that. military people had also been saying that the United States had invented some bomb, a very special small-sized bomb. Then the author says, I'm surprised to hear that. I thought the atomic bomb had been a very closely kept secret. Well, ordinary Japanese people knew nothing of this, but Army headquarters was talking about it. If any of us in the military spoke out about such secret information, the police would have come and arrested us. So, you see, they knew ahead of time. They did not warn the people, they did not prepare the people. And even during my 20 speaking tours in Japan between 2000 and 2010, I even had a woman approach me who was about 8 years old then, and her family lived in Hiroshima. Her father was in the Secret Service or in the intelligence service of the Japanese government. And 3 months before the bombing of Hiroshima, he moved his family with this young woman or this girl when she was small out of Hiroshima. And she told me after one of my talks, she was very emotional, and she said, I didn't know that. I didn't know that my father knew that Japan was going to be bombed with an atomic bomb until I was an adult. And she said about 10 years before he died, I discovered this truth. And I asked him, and he admitted it. And I said, why didn't you warn the other people in Hiroshima and relocate them? Why did you say nothing and only move us? And he really couldn't really answer her. And she said that she never spoke to him again, not even when he was dying. And I think I think that today in this interview, I'm also going to expose the fact that Japan detonated their own atomic bomb 3 days after the Nagasaki bomb. So Japan also had a nuclear weapons program, as well as other countries. And all of these came from one template. All of them were built the same way with similar characteristics to the technology and the geometric configuration of the reactor and the fuel rods in them. So the big question following this trail of clues is to expose who was behind it. And I'll tell you who was behind it. It was bankers and the Jesuits.
Now, so that's a story that we need now to unpeel. Who are the Jesuits? Why were they behind it? If they've been in Japan for several centuries, why are the bankers behind it? And why Hiroshima and Nagasaki? So, do you want to start with the New York Times, or begin to go into that?
Yes, the first atomic bomb, which was a uranium bomb, it was called Little Boy, and it was named for President Roosevelt, who was hardly a little boy. And that was dropped on August 5th, August 6th on Hiroshima. And the second bomb was a plutonium bomb. Of course, they didn't know if these would work, but they thought they would. And that was called Fat Man for Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of England. And of course, this exposes this bombing of Japan with atomic bombs as part of the agenda of the Anglo-American permanent war crimes racketeering syndicate. And that bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th of 1945.
August 9th, right.
Yes, and what is not mentioned, although it is in print, but it's not mentioned very frequently, is that the Japanese had been trying to surrender since March of 1945, and the U.S. had blocked all attempts of theirs to surrender because the atomic bombs weren't finished yet. And so it was plain and simply a false flag. It was an experiment to see what would happen. And it was a way to expose a human population and study them even to this day in the year 2015 as a rat colony of experimental animals. And to this day, it is still radioactive in those cities. The people are still dying from the radiation exposure, and the Rockefellers were the biggest profiteers and beneficiaries of those two horrific events in Japan.
Right. How was it that the Rockefellers made all the money out of this?
Well, first of all, it was a land grab and a fire sale because Hiroshima was completely flattened. I mean, they had mostly wooden houses then, and periodically fires would just happen, break out, and wipe out a whole section or area of a city. But this was different. They, first of all, 2.5 million people were killed just by the firebombing that the U.S. Military did from airplanes. And then Colonel Henry Stimson, who was Secretary of War in World War I and World War II, and he was a member of Skull and Bones. He also had ties to Churchill and the City of London bankers and financiers. And he was the one who chose Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what occurred is that one day, General Leslie Groves, who was in charge of the Manhattan Project to build these bombs for the U.S. government by the Army, he walked into the war office of headquarters of Colonel Stimson, and he had some documents in his hand. And Stimson looked at him and he said, "Are those the targets? Is that the list of targets for the A-bombs?" And General Groves got really nervous. He didn't want to give the list of targets to the Secretary of War because his own bosses hadn't even seen them yet. And Stimson took them out of his hands and said, "I'm making the decision. I'm picking the targets. Nobody else is. I'm doing it, and don't argue about it." And it was very strange that he selected Hiroshima and Nagasaki because they were not military targets. So why was he picking civilian targets? And over the years, the purpose has emerged, and the hidden agenda for bombing these two cities was to destroy the hidden Christians who were Japanese and had been converted by the Jesuits in the 1500s when they first arrived in Nagasaki for the very first time. And because Christianity was spreading across Asia like wildfire, the financiers in the City of London and Wall Street wanted to stop the spread of Christianity in Asia because Christians traditionally have been opposed to usury, which is how the bankers make their business. They make their money. by charging interest on loans. And so the the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, was followed by the bombing of Nagasaki, which was a little different because a New York Times reporter named Lawrence was on that plane in the co-pilot's seat, and he was a civilian. What was a civilian from the New York Times doing in the most top secret project that the United States probably had ever done, the military? And that pilot also went 5 miles off course and flew over or very close to the Urukami Catholic Cathedral, which was owned by the Jesuits. And it was the largest Christian cathedral in all of Asia. And the date also, August 9th, was the day of the Mass in that cathedral for the feast day of the Redemption of Mary. And that cathedral was named for Mary. But it's called, the neighborhood is called Urukami, and it was the second largest population in that neighborhood of Japanese Christians. And 2/3 of the people, no, everyone at the Mass that day was killed. I have been to Urukami Cathedral. I walked around it. There's no roof on it. The statues that decorate, you know, the entryway and other parts of the building are damaged. The walls are still up. There's grass growing inside the church and around it. And I was walking around it, and I saw blobs of melted glass from that event still lying on the ground around the edges of the church. And I reached down and picked one up, and I can't tell you what a sensation it was to be there and to feel that cold glass in my hand. And when I looked closely at it, I saw the finger bones of a human being that had been captured, that had been preserved in that molten glass. And I dropped it on the ground and ran away. It was so disturbing and upsetting, but the whole spirit and the electromagnetic um, um, environment was so charged. I just had to get out of there and to get away from that event. It was so horrifying to me. And what was the worst thing of all, of going to Japan for the first time as an American, knowing that my country had not only bombed 2 cities in Japan and killed hundreds of thousands of people, um, but exposed every living person, every living thing in Japan as well, was contaminated by the fallout. And to know that I had worked in 2 nuclear weapons labs myself, and I didn't even know what a nuclear weapon was until I went to Japan. And that is the extent of the secrecy and the cover up in the United States by our government and government agencies, and of course by the beneficiaries, the Wall Street and London bankers, who want to continue using nuclear technologies to make money with. And that was seeing the peace museums in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, seeing 10,000 people at a memorial event in Hiroshima, all seated in chairs in the ruins of the bombing, and to see the hope and the forgiveness. It was tremendously moving for me. And then to top it all off, they had these huge uh, bronze Japanese bells suspended from um, architectural things that had been supports that had been put up, and the people came, the monks came, and they hit those bells, and the tone of those bells chilled me all the way to the bone. Um, Really, Alfred, I wish that you could have shared that with me. It's something every world leader before they take office should visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right. And in fact, you talk about how the Jesuits may have even um, uh, set the date of Hiroshima and Nagasaki around the Jesuit anniversary. Could you talk
That's
a bit about that?
Yes, the Jesuits first arrived in Japan in the Age of Exploration on August 15th in 1549, I believe, and they arrived on the day of the redemption of the, what's it called? I just forgot. Uh,
Assumption?
the Assumption of the redemption of Mary. And ever since then, the that anniversary has been chosen for all of the attacks and the terrorism practiced on the Japanese Christians, and that's why they were hidden Christians for so long. In fact, the Japanese government didn't know until these two bombings even how many hidden Christians there were in Japan. But Japan, uh, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had the two largest populations, and Nagasaki, of course, was the city where the Jesuits first landed when they came to Japan in 1549, and they began converting Japanese Buddhists and Shinto believers or worshippers to Christianity. And it's this is a statue of a hybrid or a fusion of Mary, our Catholic Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the Kuan Yin, which represents the overseeing uh, female figure in Buddhism in Asia. And this is the only place in Japan where this fusion or this iconography is expressed. This is in Nagasaki only. And this is the purple fan, which the attendees are given as a gift for attending the Nagasaki event, and it's usually really hot because it's August in Japan, and everyone is using fans. And this is the origami. This represents the origami paper crane that represents the Hiroshima bombing and the recovery afterwards. And it was just a very life changing event. It was very, very shocking. I felt very ashamed of what my country and my government had done, and I can't blame the people because they just didn't know, and most of them still don't know. And how many years later is this? 75, something like that. So the Japanese have also um, put together exhibits of large poster-sized black and white photographs of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki events, and they will ship those to people for exhibits or to put in their libraries as an exhibit or schools or wherever they want to all over the world. And they just told me over and over again because we brought them to the city of Berkeley, and the event was very well attended. They were in the library for a month, I think, And even Japanese members of the parliament came to Berkeley to thank us and to thank us for opposing the anti-war movement, for opposing the bombing of Iraq in 2003. There were huge demonstrations all over the world, the biggest, I think, in world history, against the war continuing against Iraq in 2003. So it was a very exciting time. It was a very moving time. Um, and the use of nuclear weapons has simply increased since then, in violation of the wishes of the world citizenry, and even people in the government, even people in the military are opposed to nuclear weapons because they're affected by them also. The bombing, continual bombing of Iraq and Afghanistan with depleted uranium, neutron bombs, and other kinds of mini nukes has caused the decline of the population in Europe. And in 2007, it reached a peak that caused a precipitous drop in the European population, which means that production from labor went on a sharp decline, and a cofactor was that it caused a huge escalation and exponential increase in debt to the IMF by the debtor countries who couldn't pay back the loans that they'd taken out because the productivity of the countries declined. So you see how the bankers are making more money and more money and more money by creating nuclear wars. They are the main beneficiaries, and not only that, for instance, in the United States in the last 10 years, JP Morgan Chase Bank has bought up a lot of not pharmaceutical companies, but drugstores. And they now own CVS Pharmacy, and they're making huge amounts of money, not only on weaponry development and selling weapons to countries all over the world that destroy the planet and make people sick, but they own the pharmacies now that provide the medicine to the affected population. So it's just repeat business, repeat business, repeat business. And then it's also depopulating the whole planet and targeted cities and regions so that they can do land grabs. And what the Rockefellers did was they bought all of Hiroshima for pennies on the dollar, probably even less than that, and redeveloped the city even though it was radioactive. And they sell the land in Hiroshima by the square centimeter. And the land is so expensive that most people can never afford to buy a house. So they spend money on fancy cars. They live in little tiny cramped apartments and almost never entertain at home. And they also spend large amounts of money on weddings. And a kimono in Japan for a wedding can cost $80,000.
Right, right. Now, you when you were there, you introduced a new radiation risk model, and also there were lawsuits for Ibakusha. These are the victims of the atomic bombing for the first time against the Japanese government. Could you talk about some of that work?
Well, after the events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, there was a huge population, hundreds of thousands of people directly affected in those cities by the fallout and the radiation exposure. And since this had never happened before, it was unprecedented, and people had no idea how to treat uh, radi- radiation exposure and radiation illnesses. Um, and also because it was totally, the whole country was devastated by the military attacks on Japan. There was almost nothing to that they usually used for the wounded and injured people. And I know quite a few of the doctors who are hibakusha, or survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki themselves. And I had many conversations with them. I did press conferences with them. I had long discussions with them. And they told me that because blood is very similar to the function of seawater, after all, life came out of the sea and evolved into mammals and birds and other things. The seawater functions, or I should say, blood functions as seawater when we lived in water in the oceans. So they got seaweed and extracted the juice from it, and they gave transfusions to the affected survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they were able to keep them alive. It oxygenated their blood, and it provided nutrients. It was a brilliant thing to do. Another thing they did was to put people on macrobiotic diets, which is fermented food, miso, and a lot of the Japanese diet, pickled food, pickled vegetables, and fruit. And that diet also prevented cancer and other illnesses in those in Fukushima Prefecture who were lucky enough to be able to use a macrobiotic diet after the Fukushima nuclear disaster in the power plant in 2011. So every disaster is also an opportunity to develop new ideas, to develop new technologies, to develop new remedies. And the Chinese pictogram or kanji representation, it's a word, but it's a picture of something that is a word. Um, for disaster is also the word for opportunity. So when these horrific things happen, we must also remember that very good things and very important progress can come out of them also if we treat and handle and respond to these disasters in the right way. And it's very important to keep your spirituality clean and strong, because that is what drives us into positive action versus falling into negative action.
Right, right. Now, there, so that we're really looking at then, however, global. What this launch was global nuclear kabuki theater, and that these bombings that occurred at this time really started the global nuclear kabuki theater,
Yes,
which we even see going on at present, where people are flashing nuclear warnings at each other.
that's correct. Let me just read just a minute. I don't, let me see. My mouse is thing. So, what I'd like to do is to read a paragraph, um, to read a comment. Um, the the New York Times, because it was a total cover up right away, The New York Times was the main cover-up mouthpiece reporter. I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong one. Just a minute. Where is it? This is a quote by Richard C. Cook, former U.S. federal government analyst, and he published this in 2008. He said, as the 20th century advanced, the financier elite became heavily involved in getting rich off World War and the manufacture of the new weapons of mass destruction that modern technology made possible. Warfare and weaponry, combined with control of credit manufactured through the leveraging of industrial production, were to be the primary means of putting nations and their populations into debt. And that is happening exactly just that way today. And they've been doing it ever since World War II, and they were doing it before World War II, but not with the same technologies. He goes on to say a materialistic slave society was being created, which books like 1984 warned us against. Humanity was lured into compliance through the fantasy world brought about by the mass media by means of advertising, cinema, and television. It's brainwashing. Another enticement was the growing availability of mass-produced consumer goods. So I would like to go now to the beginning, the seeds, the founding fathers of what has become global nuclear kabuki theater. In other words, these are false flag wars, and they are set up by both sides who collaborate and cooperate through especially their intelligence agencies, so they get on the same page. And if you are clever, and if you're informed and you're aware, you can watch the Austrian foreign minister in the news, because all this is coming out of the former Habsburg Empire, which extended from Portugal across Europe. It included Russia, Germany, Italy, and the countries in between, France and Spain. And they are the relics, or they are the follow-ups or the new iteration of the Roman Empire. So these are traditions and people and bloodlines that have been doing this for thousands of years. And as I've been saying in our interviews, these are ancient Iranian bloodlines, the Uzbek and Tajik tribes, who are the Aryans or the Indo-Europeans who settled Europe. And all Europeans are from Central Asia. And most Europeans have more Mongolian blood in them from the Genghis Khan influence than even the Central Asian tribes, who also intermarried with the Mongols. So you can see how this is an ancient tradition and roots and everything. And it just keeps rolling along, going along with a new mask every 30 years or 50 years or whatever. And it's a permanent warfare society. So this started the nuclear, I should say, the theoretical and experimental nuclear physics started before 1900 even. And in 1898, Marie Curie was given a ton of pitchblende by the Austrian government to use in her experiments to study uranium and uranium decay products. And she and her husband, Pierre Curie, very carefully extracted tiny, tiny, tiny atomic quantities of uranium and uranium decay products from pitchblende. And of course, she wanted, and Pierre Curie wanted it to be used for the benefit of humanity. And instead, it was perverted and changed to be used as a detriment against humanity to make profits for the bankers. So that was the beginning, and she was one of the early nuclear pioneers. But in Japan, there was tremendous interest during the Meiji period at the turn of the century in theoretical and experimental nuclear physics, and there were many Japanese scientists who went to Europe after their postdocs and worked in the different experimental laboratories and in theoretical institutions as well. And they went back to Japan and they started a nuclear bomb project even before 1930. And almost no one knows about this. Every time I said Japan has a nuclear weapons program, a secret one, while I was in Japan on 20 speaking tours, the anti-nuclear organization Gensikin and Gensikyo, the biggest ones in Japan, slapped their hands over my face and told me to shut up and denied it. So it's very, very taboo in Japan to bring it up, but I did. And the other work that I did, which I forgot to finish talking about, was teaching the lawyers representing the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I spent the summer of 2003 all night in their offices teaching them a new radiation risk model, which was developed for the Greens in the European Parliament by Dr. Chris Busby. And he had just published it. I said, give that to me. I'm taking it to Japan. They had it translated in 3 weeks and republished. And those lawyers would arrive in the office where I was waiting for them every evening, pop their briefcases open, and they had a copy of that risk model in English and in Japanese. And they went to the courts with that risk model. They had never won a lawsuit in the history since 1945 of attempts to get the Japanese government to provide the survivors with medical care, medical benefits. They had nothing. And the Japanese government said, oh, they're just lazy. They want to sleep all day. Well, they had chronic fatigue syndrome and almost no energy produced in their bodies. They weren't able to work. And on the day that you and I were flying to Malaysia, I opened the International Herald Tribune, and the front page story was about the very first lawsuit that was won. And they won them in the two most conservative courts in Japan, Nagoya and Hiroshima. And so since then, it's been a cascade of successful lawsuits against the Japanese government to get treatment for these poor people. And Japan was involved in development of nuclear technologies very, very early on, and even they even won a Nobel Prize. One of them did for his experimental work, theoretical work. So the first one was in 1905. Hantaro Nagaoka, And at that time, the theoretical scientists did not know what the structure of the atom was. So he came up with his theory, along with Thomson, Leonard, and Rutherford, who had different models. And his model was called it was called Nagaoka's Saturnian model. In other words, it was planets or that represented the electrons orbiting around the nucleus. He also did his postdoc in Vienna, Berlin, and Munich, and he graduated from Tokyo University in 1887. He was with the early European pioneers in theoretical and experimental physics, and he also worked on Japan's nuclear weapons program during the World War II period. In 1928, Dr. Yoshio Nishina authored the Klein-Nishina formulas, which led to discovery of the Compton effect. And that's that tiny particles reflect sunlight from the sun. And this was after he visited the British Cavendish lab, the George August University in Göttingen, Germany. And then he worked and did research in Copenhagen with Niels Bohr. And then in Professor Hikosaka Todoyoshi, he worked on atomic physics, and he discovered or predicted there was huge amounts of energy in the nucleus of these atoms and or nuclear materials, and they could be used to generate electricity. Of course, that's the nuclear power program that we know of today, and also weapons. So they knew in 1934 that they could produce energy in nuclear weapons by unleashing that huge amount of energy. And the reason the energy regime is so high in the nucleus of atoms is because, for instance, uranium and plutonium form in supernovas. All of the elements that make up our Earth and matter have formed out in outer space in planetary and star processes. And these are energy regimes and temperatures and electrical levels that are so intense they are not experienced on Earth, but they were out in space. So when you release the energy from an atom of plutonium or uranium, you're introducing tiny pieces or tiny amounts of energy that represent the energy regime of a supernova. Now, our bodies are basically a bag of water. So when you ingest or inhale or the radioactive materials go through your skin into your tissues, you are exposing your body to energy regimes that are unknown to humans on Earth. And your body does not have a good day. In 1936, Dr. Yoshio Nishina he's the one who co-authored the Klein-Nishina formula. By 1936, he had built the first 26-inch cyclotron in Japan in the Riken laboratory in Tokyo. And it's the Rikagaku Kenkyusho laboratory. And it's actually in English, it means the Institute of Physical and Chemical Research. He had over 100 young scientists in that laboratory, supported by the Japanese government, doing research and and theoretical, experimental. And he built a 60-inch cyclotron by 1938 with a 250-ton magnet. Now, how did he get that magnet? Well, it was Ernest Lawrence in Berkeley at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab who invented the cyclotron in 1930. And it was Ernest Lawrence who was very friendly with these Japanese, and he trained some of the scientists, the young men who were working for Nishina. And so they came back with Ernest Lawrence's ideas and concepts and experience there. And Ernest Lawrence was himself making a 60-inch cyclotron, so he just had two 250-ton magnets made, and he shipped one to Nishina in Japan as a gift. So you can see the collaboration and cooperation between the Japanese scientists and the American scientists, but it gets better than that. In 1930, when Nishina went to Japan, an Austrian chemical engineer named Fritz Hansberg accompanied Nishina to Japan to set up their nuclear bomb project. And it is Hansberg that I began doing research on because I discovered he had also gone to Manchuria during the 30s and handed off this nuclear atomic bomb template to the Russians, the Soviet Russians in Manchuria. He probably also gave it to China. He ended up giving it to the British, to the Germans, everyone who had a nuclear program in World War II received it, the template, the original plans from Dr. Hansberg. And he even came to the San Francisco Bay Area and worked with Ernest Lawrence and gave the template to the Americans. And he also set up a magnesium plant in south of San Francisco, and so they could have magnesium to extract uranium from uranium ore, so that they could make the core of the nuclear bomb. Very, very surprising. Very, very interesting too. Now, I began now in 1941. After this collaboration between Lawrence and Nishina, I discovered that in 1941, the Army minister, General Tojo, gave the official order to develop an atomic bomb. And it was these scientists under Nishina and other groups of scientists in Kyoto and other universities who all collaborated and cooperated and had parts of the program to develop themselves. Because of the U.S. bombing and the embargo on Japan, they moved the nuclear weapons program and all these hundreds of scientists up to Pyongyang in the northern part of Korea. It was not divided at that time. And they put the scientists in a cave deep underground, and they produced the magnesium and whatever else they needed to produce in a I think it was a fertilizer company facility, and the industrialists who owned that had been already producing magnesium in the 1920s for the Japanese A-bomb project, and also heavy water. That industrialist in the 1920s was producing heavy water for the bomb program that hadn't even started in Japan. Now, in 1945, of course, the Genzai Bakuden, which in English means greatest fighter, was produced, and it was tested on an island in Northern Korea, offshore, 3 days after the Nagasaki bomb. And then the Russians, the Soviets rushed in and took over the northern part of Korea. And the scientists who did not escape were taken to the Soviet Union. I personally think they stayed there deliberately for transfer to the Soviet Union because they knew that Japan would be occupied by the United States. So they were transferred to the Soviet Union, where they assisted the Russians, the Soviet Russians, in uh, conducting their own nuclear weapons program. And the U.S. sent big printing press plates to the Soviets, as well as materials for their nuclear weapons program. And these printing plates were sent so that the Soviets could print U.S. money, U.S. dollars that would pay for their program. So you can see it's so important for people to understand that all these wars are phony, and behind the scenes, bankers, the intelligence community, even the mafia, the yakuza, and the militaries, they're all collaborating globally, and it's the citizens who are getting, with every war, all of their accumulated wealth from each generation is sucked out of their country or out of their reach by the bankers who are funding and encouraging and setting up all these phony wars. And this is true in this war going on in the Ukraine. It's true of Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Everybody's collaborating and cooperating with each other, and they're making all the money. Look at the Bushes. Look at Cheney. Look at Tony Blair. They're all running around selling protection to governments from American aggression. That's what Hillary Clinton did for two periods serving as U.S. Secretary of State. She traveled more than any other Secretary of State in U.S. history, and she was selling protection to governments all over the world, India, Pakistan, all over the world. And that brought hundreds of millions of dollars from those governments into the Clinton Foundation, and they never paid any tax on it. So now we know how the politicians get rich. It's by extortion and racketeering. And there's an excellent book written by some Polish intellectuals called Political Ponerology. Ponerology is the study of evil, and political ponerology is the study of political evil. So people should really read that book and begin to understand what politics are really all about, and what politicians are really like. So um, that was the the bombing, the end of the bombing. But I wanted to know more about Fritz Hunsker and who his mentor was. And what I discovered was that Fritz Hunsker had been recruited as a graduate student in a university in Vienna. He was a chemical engineer, and he had been recruited by a man who was named Emil F. Winter, who was an industrialist and a banker in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And when I started researching Emil F. Winter, I discovered, first of all, I found his mausoleum that he built 10 or 15 years before he died in Pittsburgh. And it's a gigantic display of Egyptian uh, tomb icons and statues and carvings. And there he is standing dressed up as an Egyptian with two Egyptian servants of gods on either side of him, and that's on the bronze door that goes into the room where his body lies. And of course, this represents the ancient Egyptian cult of death known as Isis. So there it is. Isis is what the New World Order worships. They are not Christians. They are not Jews. They are not Buddhists. They are not atheists. They are death worshippers, and they worship the cult of Isis. And what is happening now in Central Asia, in the Middle East, especially where there are pipelines planned or there are pipelines, we have this new iteration of Al Qaeda, which was formed by the U.S. In Afghanistan, and now we have ISIL, ISIL, and other iterations of that name. But it's all the same. It's a culture of death created for the military to do terrorism in regions where we have geopolitical agendas and hegemony that we want to express and project. And so I did more research on Winter. I said, well, who is he really? This is, why was he working in Austria? Well, as I said before, Austria represents the Habsburg Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, which was after the fall of the Roman Empire and the Roman Empire. And these are all ancient Iranian bloodlines and setups. And so I discovered obituaries are really good places to get accurate information because it's the one place they don't lie. And there were all kinds of cover stories all over Fritz Hansberg, but I found his obituary, probably his wife wrote it, and that represented where he'd really been, for instance, in Manchuria, transferring these atomic bomb designs to the Russians and other aspects of his life. And I also discovered in the obituary of Mr. Winter, it had his parents' names and middle name and last name. And the middle name his parents carried was Bauer, Bauer. And that is Rothschild. The Bauers are Rothschilds, and there are lots of them. And the Bauer name was changed in the 1700s by Amstel Meyer to Rothschild. And if you meet Bowers, you could be pretty sure, or it's very likely, that they are Rothschilds. So he was a Rothschild. Now I kept looking, for instance, in blogs and genealogy discussion groups and things like that. And last night I discovered that some villagers in a tiny village of 6,000 people in Austria on the border with Italy were writing comments in this blog in the U.S. And one of them, the first one, said, "Well, I live in this village, and I know Mr. Winter, and he came and started a mine here for magnesite, which is the ore for magnesium, and he also was from Dusseldorf or Darmstadt in Germany, and he also had ties to I.F. Farben, which we know in World War II, George H.W. Bush's family, father and so forth, had ties to Farben. And Farben was involved with other very wealthy families. We could call them oligarchical families in the U.S. And it was a Nazi operation. So Mr. Winter was not just a nobody. Also, he co-founded Pittsburgh Steel, and of course I mentioned he was a banker, financier also. And he started another company which he turned out to be the largest producer in the world in World War II. Now, how did someone have such a helicopter ride to success and produce millions and millions of dollars in profits and so forth, and have such success in business when other people who were just as talented or even more so could not do that, could not achieve that? He has to be a very special person. And the answer is he is the had Austrian links, and he is the man who distributed the template for nuclear weapons as a Rothschild agent for the Jesuits who are running the previous Habsburg Empire. And they, of course, are from ancient Iranian bloodlines. The Jesuits at the very top are ancient Iranian bloodlines, and that is Stalin was Iranian. He was born in Iran. He became the head of Russia, the dictator of Russia, Soviet Union. Tito of Yugoslavia, and in these bloodlines, these ancient Central Asian bloodlines, it goes through the mother. It's not through the father. Ataturk was his mother was from a tribe very, very close to where Stalin came from in the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea. The Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, his father overthrew the legitimate Qajar dynasty. They were Uzbeks from Central Asia. His father overthrew it and became he was an army colonel. He became the dictator of Iran. And then his son, Reza Pahlavi, became the crowned Shah of Iran. And the Pahlavis in Italy, all of Italy, the Romans were Iranians, and all of Italy with these wild Asian tribes. I mean, you go to Italy and you're not in the rest of Europe. It's completely different people. And traditions and the burial practices are different. The body shapes are different. Milan has such a beautiful textile and very fine silks and damasks and brocade and beautiful clothing. I mean, they're the fashion center of the world, really. But they have very slim figures, and these are all originally Central Asians who for the last 5,000 years have maintained very, very strict breeding programs. And if you follow weddings of royals and aristocracy, nobility, for instance, in Italy, you can learn a lot about how this whole system is set up and how they maintain control and power and their wealth. And these people, these ancient Iranians who have settled and built the Etruscan Empire, they razed that, and they built the Roman Empire. They razed that. They built the Holy Roman Empire. They razed that, and then they built the Habsburg Empire, and they razed that. And each time they destroy the civilization they've built or created, they absolutely strip it of all the wealth, roll up everyone in it, even collaborators and cooperators with their operation. Everybody dies, and then they do a scorched earth policy and start all over again. And if you want to know what's happening, the Western countries and the Western economy are being rolled up and scorched to the earth, because there is a new world order coming, and it is centered in Russia. Putin is the visionary and the master of giving the commands now, but China is also involved. And if people are looking for the area of the world to go to for new opportunities, because this whole world we're living in the West is collapsing, the economy, the health, everything, the government, then China and Russia are the best place to go for opportunities to be entrepreneurs. And it's a um, multi lateral. It's a multilateral opportunity, Russia and China, to start your life over, or to live the last years of your life in a very exciting environment, because they are not unipolar. They are multipolar, and they are restoring the Silk Road economy, the Silk Road mentality or way of doing business, which is to collaborate and cooperate, nations to do that, or peoples and regions to do that in order to create new wealth. The economy that the West has created is a culture of death. It's a culture of looting and thieving and stealing and destroying other populations in order to steal their wealth, and it is not sustainable. It also costs a lot of money to destroy everything. And what's the point of doing that? Why not cooperate and collaborate and be happy and and share energy and share ideas? It creates more wealth than when you have to steal it after you kill everyone. Um, it's crazy. And World War II was the Jesuit plan and the Jesuit agenda to steal the accumulated wealth along the Silk Road from 5,000 years of peaceful trading. And that's what they did. The Emperor of Japan sent the imperial princes and the imperial military, the Japanese military, into China, looted the whole country, killed many, many people. Then they went on to Southeast Asia, and it had to be the Jesuits, it had to be the ancient Iranians at the top, who knew about all of that wealth that accumulated over all those thousands of years, because they were part of that prosperity. They made the finest silk in the world in Central Asia, in Uzbek and Tajikistan. And that is how they got wealthy all along the Silk Road, especially during the Roman Empire period. And remember, they were Iranians too. So they knew about fine silk and fine brocades. And even Genghis Khan used to trade horses for the Central Asian silk. They loved silk. It was beautiful. It still is. And who produces really beautiful silk now, and clothing and everything? It's the Italians. And the motifs on the silk, on the brocades and the damasks, they're Central Asian symbols. The two-headed eagle that is the icon that represents Germany, and so many other mythological animals and beings that are part of Central Asian history and sociology and their culture. They're all over Europe and the rest of the world. People don't know that history. They don't know what they symbolize. But the way I discovered all of this and found all these threads to follow is because I have a master's degree in ancient history, Near Eastern history, and also Central Asian. And I started looking at signs and symbols, and I said, oh my God, this is Central Asian. Oh my God, this is Central Asian. And I discovered that Fidel Castro, the dictator of Cuba, who everyone knows is a Jesuit, is at the very top of the Jesuits, and he Iranian. He's a product of an Iranian ancient breeding program, and his father came from Spain. He was supposed to be an artichoke picker or something, some lowly agricultural worker, but he immediately bought an 11,000 acre sugar plantation when he arrived in Cuba. Well, somebody who picked artichokes in the fields under the hot sun didn't have that kind of money. And as it turns out, Castro's bodyguard for 31 years has just written in a biography and exposed who Fidel Castro really is. He's a womanizer. He had many businesses in Cuba. He had palaces on islands offshore from Cuba. And he and his sons are the products of very strict breeding programs. And it's pretty interesting that Castro is a part of the Vatican nobility. In other words, he is descended directly from Pope Paul III, who started the Jesuits in the 1500s and who gave the family his son. He had illegitimate children before he became Pope, and he gave his son and nephews 3 titles of Duke from papal properties and gave them the properties as well. So that's why Castro's last name is Castro. He's from the branch of the family that are the Dukes of Castro. And there are also the Dukes of Piacenza. I discovered that Castro's father was actually born in Piacenza in northern Italy. He wasn't born in Spain, and he was no agricultural worker either. And then there was another ducal title. I think it was Pima, but I'm not sure. And so when you follow these signs and symbols, it's such a great adventure. You learn so much. And when people are very mono information centered, for instance, just on one discipline or one this or one that, they miss the truth because everything is connected.
Well, thank you. I think you've really brought together a tapestry today and a memorial for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Is there anything that you had wanted to say that perhaps you haven't brought up to the audience yet?
Yes, I would just like to mention Fukushima. Why did Fukushima happen to Japan? Why did Fukushima happen at all? And who caused Fukushima? And what I discovered, and I've been to Japan on 20 speaking tours. I've been all over Japan. I've met many, many people. I've been toured nuclear power plants there. I've had people give me documents. I've spoken in the Japanese parliament. I'm new to the Japanese parliament. And the next day you were the star of a gigantic press conference in the Japanese parliament, the Kokai. And I just remember you turning to me, Alfred, saying, "Oh, now I know why you come to Japan so often." I said, "Yeah, I can actually get something done that's positive." And what I want to say to point out is that the nuclear disaster at Fukushima that occurred on March 11th, 2011, no, was it March 5th? I'm not sure. Anyway, it occurred in Japan, in the Fukushima prefecture in northern Japan, in the early part of March 2011, and it was a nuclear power plant that was not designed. These were Westinghouse. No, they were General Electric nuclear reactors, which were designed by the Rockefellers or GE. And these reactors were designed for uranium fuel rods. However, um, MOX fuel rods. This is mixed oxide of plutonium and uranium were put into those reactors. And a friend of mine, a General Electric inspector named Kei Sugaoka, he had been in that power plant and discovered they had MOX fuel there. They hadn't put them in the reactors yet. And this was maybe in 2004, sometime around then. Well, he had just been laid off or let go by General Electric for no reason after 30 years of loyal, faithful service. And he also, because he was Japanese American, had meticulous notes from every single day he'd worked over that entire period of his career with GE. And he said, they cannot put MOX in those reactors, they'll blow up. So he flew to Japan. He went to the governor of Fukushima Prefecture, which means a province or state. And he met with him and had all of the documentation that showed that TEPCO, the nuclear power company, had been falsifying safety reports and other fraud. And they went on television together, and the governor passed a law that no MOX could be used or placed in any reactor in that prefecture ever again, and had it removed. Now, in Japan, the governors of prefectures have more power in their prefecture than the federal government. So he was able to make that ruling or make that law and make it stick. But then he left as governor, somebody else was elected. And what we discovered was that in September of 2010, just 6 months before Fukushima blew up, the Israelis came into Fukushima nuclear power plant and they put in a new security system. They didn't really need one, but they were there putting it in. And we also discovered that the MOX fuel rods were also placed in the plant in that same month illegally. That was breaking the law. And by November of 2010, 70 computers in Japan had the Stuxnet virus in them. And the Stuxnet virus had been placed in September of 2010 in the Fukushima computers. Now, the Stuxnet virus was written at the Idaho Nuclear Engineering Lab in the US by a Siemens team from Germany. They wrote the software for the safety system and for the controllers. And they were working with the CIA at the Idaho Nuclear Engineering Lab. Now, I found this in the mainstream media. I just knew, I don't know how I found it. I just did. And, but it was in the mainstream media. And I just knew what it meant. So
yes, could I interrupt? We're
Yes.
getting a fair amount of outside interference on the line as you're explaining about the Stuxnet virus. This is outside. We don't have control of it. Okay, welcome back. You know, what occurred, Leuren, is that as soon as you started speaking about Stuxnet, there was an extraordinary intervention by an outside electromagnetic force that forced us to shut down. So could you please start again on the whole Stuxnet, sparing no detail? Let's find out exactly what happened here with Stuxnet and Fukushima.
Okay. In the summer of 2010, 6 months before the Fukushima disaster, the U.S. and an Israeli team introduced the Stuxnet virus, which was unknown until this time, to the operating system of either Natanz or Bushehr, one of the the Persian Iranian nuclear facilities in Iran. And in the room where the high-speed centrifuges were that do the uranium separation, the operators in the operating room, the command room, command and control room, were watching the monitors, and everything indicated that the centrifuges were operating just fine. But what was actually happening was the Stuxnet virus had sent these signals to the operating room that everything was normal, while at the same time they were sending messages to the controllers of the centrifuges, and they made them spin uncontrollably fast, and they all flew apart. They just started flying apart and hitting each other, and the whole room self-destructed. And that's how the Stuxnet virus operates in an operating system. Now, the Stuxnet virus was created starting at about 2002 by the CIA and a secret team from Siemens, controller manufacturing company in Germany. And they make the controllers for a lot of power plants, including nuclear power plants. So they went to the Idaho Nuclear Engineering Lab, and I found this in the mainstream media, actually. I was shocked, but they wrote the Stuxnet virus in Idaho at that nuclear engineering lab, and it was handed off to Israel just as it had been the summer before, for the infection or the installation in the Iranian facilities. And it was probably introduced on a little USB stick. All they do is stick it in a computer, and the Stuxnet jumps into the operating system and hides. And then it gets triggered by various ways. They can send signals externally, or they can set a timer in it or whatever. And anyway, that was introduced in the Fukushima operating system for that power plant in September 2010. So when the earthquake and tsunami happened in the Fukushima power plant in early March 2011, the operators had no idea why they couldn't get the emergency power system working to keep the damaged reactors cool. They have to keep them in cooling water flowing, or they go into meltdown. They could not get the emergency generators to work, no matter what they tried. So there was a complete meltdown, even by, I believe, even before midnight on the day of the earthquake and tsunami. But the meltdown had already started 15 minutes after the earthquake and 45 minutes before the tsunami. So it was not the tsunami that caused the meltdown. It was no cooling in the reactors. That resulted in horrific explosions, releasing huge amounts of radiation and a complete loss of the molten fuel from the reactors. They melted right through the reactor container, right through the floor, and they dripped down into the basement of the reactor buildings and continued melting through the floor into the geologic environment that the reactors were the plant was sitting on. Now, that fuel has been down there a number of years. It's still fissioning. It's still producing huge amounts of heat, and the groundwater is now heating up where that molten fuel is, and creating steam explosions. They're called hydrovolcanic explosions from turned into steam and blowing up. So that causes very, very high levels of radiation to be released into the atmosphere from cracks in the ground between the buildings. It's also all the water flowing off of the volcanic spine of Japan in that area is flowing through this molten fuel and carrying huge amounts of radiation, just enormous amounts, into the lagoon offshore from the plant and then into the ocean. And that is circulating all through the northern Pacific into the Atlantic, and it eventually will pollute and poison all of the oceans. What we're seeing now, just offshore from San Francisco, or along the beaches just off of San Francisco, we've had over 14 dead whales in the month of July wash up on the beaches with no explanation for why they died. They're different species, they're different ages, there's no explanation, they have different feeding patterns. And also up in Alaska, I believe it's around Kodiak Island, they've had 18 dead whales in July also. And this is because of these hydrovolcanic underground explosions releasing huge amounts of radiation into the Pacific. And the cover-up story is that it's an algae bloom in the North Pacific that's poisoning all the fish that the whales eat and so forth. It's not. It's huge pulses of highly radioactive contaminated water being released into the ocean and poisoning the food and poisoning the sea life. Now, when Fukushima exploded, scientists all over the world working on nuclear issues started doing research on the Fukushima event. They're always looking. This is a new experiment for people, nuclear engineers and nuclear physicists, to study and identify new phenomenon. And what happened is that I found a paper presented at a scientific conference in the Habsburg Palace in Vienna. It's a former Habsburg Empire palace. And this paper explained the phenomenon that when nuclear weapons were injected high into the atmosphere for testing, they released an electromagnetic pulse, which knocked out all the communication, for instance, in ships at the Bikini Atoll nuclear bomb tests. And those Navy ships, 100 of them, couldn't go anywhere for a couple of weeks until the Van Allen belts, the electromagnetic field of the Earth, went back into order, because the ships rely on communications by bouncing them off of the Earth's magnetic field or interacting with it. So these scientists describe this new phenomenon, and it's called the Fukushima. It's called the blow up and pulsing and blow up neutron pulse phenomenon. And this is a new kind of weapon, because it's a kind of a neutron bomb. And these neutron pulses that came out of Fukushima damaged at least 3 other nuclear power plants within 250 miles of Fukushima. And when I began following the war, the civil war in the Ukraine a year ago, I noticed last winter, in the winter of 2014 and the new year of 2015, that there were explosions in nuclear power plants in the Ukraine, that the Ukrainian junta, the Kiev junta, illegal government, were deliberately causing by putting MOX fuel rods from Westinghouse into old Soviet-era reactors. And the heat flow was not properly configured because the cross-section of the Westinghouse rods was square, and the hole they were going into in the Soviet-era reactor was hexagonal. So you had a square peg in a hexagonal hole, and you only had the 4 corners of the fuel rod touching the reactor core. So you had very uneven heat flow, and it caused warping in the rods and then a meltdown, and then the explosion that they had just like at Fukushima. Now, when I went back to look at that Fukushima pulsing neutron event, the paper, I discovered that the authors, the scientists who had written that paper, I thought they were Russian. They were actually from the Ukraine, from a university in Odessa. And there is also a CIA laboratory in Odessa. And so what we're seeing at Fukushima is a new kind of neutron pulse weapon which is being used against civilian populations. And this is not over. It means every reactor in the world, and they're concentrated in the northern hemisphere in the superpower countries, is now vulnerable to these horrific neutron pulsing events, which biologically damage any population that's affected, but it does no harm to the infrastructure. So what you do is get rid of the population with the neutron pulses with no damage to your infrastructure, and there's no lasting residual radioactivity probably after a couple of weeks, except for the...
You know, we were just interfered with again. There are parties who obviously don't want the Stuxnet information to get out. I think we were interfered with at the time. You were just describing, you had just finished describing how every nuclear weapon, every nuclear power plant is now a neutron bomb.
Yes.
And so could you segue into what you were talking to immediately after that?
Yes. With the discovery by what I thought were Russian scientists investigating the Fukushima explosions and the pulses of radiation released into the environment, including neutron pulses that traveled as far as 250 miles away. Those damaged 3 other nuclear power plants within that a certain area of that radius of Fukushima. So these scientists wrote a nuclear research paper and presented it in the summer of about 2013 in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, which is from the period of the Habsburg Empire. And these scientists produced a paper about a new phenomenon they described and named as the Fukushima neutron pulse and blow up regime. This is a completely unknown and new phenomenon associated with nuclear power plants. In nuclear bomb tests, which were injected high into the atmosphere, it's known as a neutron pulse or an EMF pulse, but it's never been reported or discovered publicly revealed in the scientific literature. Now, when nuclear reactors started blowing up at the end of November 2014 in the Ukraine during negotiations between the Kiev junta that was trying to extort money from the European Commission, the European Union, and the IMF, they deliberately put Westinghouse nuclear fuel rods with MOX fuel in them, mixed plutonium and uranium oxide, into Soviet-era reactors that are in the Ukraine. And the cross-section for the Soviet-era, for the Westinghouse fuel rods is square. But the Soviet-era fuel rods were hexagonal and fit exactly and very tightly into the hole in the reactor core for each fuel rod. Now, what happened in Fukushima is exactly what they created redundantly in the Ukrainian nuclear power plant called Zaporizhzhia. And it exploded. They had a Chernobyl-level event and a series of them all through December of 2014. It was completely unreported, but I did get European Union monitoring data that showed the heaviest Chernobyl-level radiation contamination hovered over Greece. And this is a month before the new, before their elections, and the new prime minister was elected, who has been negotiating with the International Monetary Fund and the European Union and so forth for emergency bailout funds. Well, Ukraine couldn't whine and cry and beg anymore and get any more money out of the European funding institutions. So they blew up their own nuclear power plants, creating this neutron pulse event, described at Fukushima. And they're now using nuclear blackmail to try to force the European institutions to loan them money, which they can never pay back either. So nuclear blackmail using accidents that aren't accidents at all. They're deliberately planned, and the reactors are sabotaged with fuel rods that come from other sources. In other words, Westinghouse and GE are Rockefeller. And so it's a new kind of warfare. Unfortunately, it's very genocidal, and it's indiscriminate, and it caused a huge decline in the radiation in Afghanistan, and the Iraq wars caused a very large decline in population in Europe, and the countries that were heavily burdened with IMF loans lost productivity in their factories because their workers were sick, and that's when the IMF debt increased exponentially suddenly in about 2007. Well, that's what's going to happen in Greece. Their population is going to be wiped out from the nuclear events that were part of nuclear blackmail in the Ukraine, and Greece will never be able to pay that debt back. This is just, as I said, a continuation of the Western economy based on nuclear terrorism, nuclear events that are deliberately triggered, and nuclear blackmail and extortion. And there's no end in sight, because the whole northern hemisphere where the superpower countries are is has been heavily invested in nuclear power, and all those reactors can be turned into a Fukushima.
Right, right. Now, right now, the sort of topic du jour in nuclear kabuki theater is the proposed nuclear treaty with Iran, and which now Israel and the Republican and some Democrat forces in the U.S. are mobilizing to try and block, because of course the U.S. Senate has to ratify it under the Constitution.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And the Ayatollah and the Iranian government have been negotiating for quite a long time. They've been accused of things that they have not done. They have not done anything illegal. The IAEA has inspected them numerous times. They were in compliance with all of the conditions that they signed in the contract with various organizations and entities, and they have not done anything illegal. The conditions for having nuclear power in Iran were that the Iranians could produce their own nuclear fuel. That's all they're doing. They're producing their own nuclear fuel, which is completely legal. But the U.S. is trying to strangulate Iran. It's about pipelines. It's always about pipelines today if it's in the Middle East or Central Asia. And in fact, it was Henry Kissinger who gave nuclear power plants to Iran. Henry Kissinger started this nightmare, and we know how devious he is. And it was Gerald Ford, who was a Rockefeller spokesperson on television, advertising and supporting nuclear power, encouraging people to go for it. And it was Gerald Ford who transferred weapons-grade plutonium to Iran. So the U.S. is probably the most hypocritical country and government and corrupt in the world today. They're also the most destructive. But what has happened is that the Jesuits have taken over Congress, they've taken over the U.S., they've taken over the military. Remember, I said that that Fidel Castro is from these ancient Iranian bloodlines that run the world. Well, his family, including Fidel Castro, owned the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. In fact, they own all of the federal area of Washington, D.C. because they burned down the new fledgling capital of America during the War of 1812. My family's house in Canada, just over the border from Niagara Falls, was the headquarters for the British Army, for the British military in the War of 1812. And when you look at signs and symbols on paintings, for instance, of General Washington, the first president of the United States, his presidential portrait in Congress has Iranian signs and symbols on it. The hat of Mithra, which is part of the Zoroastrian Mithra worshiping religious protocol. And there are bundles or fasces of ancient weapons that were attached to the chariots in the Mesopotamian wars, Egyptian and so forth. And those are on the behind the speaker's podium in Congress, in the House. So Washington, D.C. is full of signs and symbols indicating that the Farnese family owns Washington, D.C. They built the Pentagon as an exact copy of the Farnese villa, the Villa Farnese, 50 miles north of Rome that was built by Pope Paul III, which is who Castro is directly descended from. And Pope Paul III was Alessandro Farnese, and Castro's middle name is Alejandro, the Spanish spelling of Alessandro, which is the Italian spelling. So we see these top level Jesuit families, and it's the Farnese family, Castro's family, that started the Jesuits. The Jesuits are just a new iteration of practices and armies that they have created before. The Jesuits are not religious. They don't believe in God. Napoleon and Dostoevsky both said that, and they both said that the Jesuits are military. They run the Pentagon, they run the Vatican, they run the Vatican Bank, and they run the Vatican. They are above the Vatican. They're the top troublemakers in the world, and they have been making trouble for over 5,000 years for every culture, every civilization on every continent, and they're not going to stop until we stop them, and until people understand who they are, how they work, what their agenda is, and how they operate and extort and everything. They're super, super, super wicked criminals. They're ruthless, and they want total slavery of the entire global population with no ownership for those slaves. They will own nothing. They will be staked to the ground until they're needed for work, and then they're taken off and used like horses or whatever, and then they're returned to captivity. So they're putting our DNA signal on satellites. We will have no money to cross or negotiate or buy things with. Everything is going to be on satellites, and if people don't want to work or they refuse to collaborate with the system, as David Rockefeller said very clearly, we'll just turn them off on the satellite.
Well, today being at least this program being to bring Hiroshima and Nagasaki and those lessons into public consciousness, what kind of proactive and positive thoughts would you like to leave with our viewers?
Well, first of all, the first Persian Empire was the Parthian Empire. And when that empire collapsed, those nobles and aristocracy and the royal family fled from Persia, and many of them went to Japan. And I always wondered why Japan was selected for the atomic bombing, the first atomic bombing of a human population, and then why did Fukushima happen to it? Because there's no way to turn it off for hundreds of years, and it's going to completely kill off the entire Japanese population. There will be no one left who survives this, and I couldn't understand why until I finally realized they are very, very mixed with Iranian bloodlines. And it must be that the Japanese population is so advanced in scientific and technology and so forth that they must be a threat to these ancient Iranian bloodlines who are ruling the world. And I really think because the Japanese were involved in research in alternative energy. They were running cars on water. They were creating all kinds of new technologies for free electricity and things like that. They are so advanced that they're a terrible threat to these top-level Iranian ancient bloodlines that rule the world. And so I want everyone to know how dangerous they are and how few of them there are, and how many of us there are. And we must begin to share this information and new awareness of where the real danger is. The Zionists are not the real danger. They're just the pawns for these top-level Iranians. And anyway, they don't respect anyone who helps them or makes them richer or carries out their agenda or their orders. Everybody goes in the garbage can who is a threat or who is no longer used. They're just tossed away and burned up with radiation. So we have no choice. If we want to live, if we want to survive on this planet, people have to begin taking actions. And there are more of us. There are all kinds of ways for people on their own as individuals to begin to undermine them. And it's like an ant farm. You let the ants loose and they go everywhere, and they're tiny and they're hard to catch and everything. But their collective impact is what that makes the day. That is what brings the change. That is what does the damage. That is how we have to approach this, like swarming insects. And that is, by the way, a military strategy, and the military does study swarming insects because an army can be wiped out by them. So I don't want people to be afraid. There's nothing to be afraid of except not knowing what is true, what is happening, and why. And then we must begin to share the information, come together, and begin to figure out solutions. Maybe we can make friends with them. Maybe we can share things with them. They don't want to share anything with us. And they fooled people for so long. They're so good at propaganda and hiding who they are. You go and try to find a history of Central Asia that's really comprehensive. There aren't any. And yet, that's where almost all people on the Eurasian continent came from, Central Asia. And they don't even know it. It's from DNA studies that have been done from the Atlantic to the Pacific across the whole Eurasian continent. And those DNA studies are really, really interesting, and you cannot argue with DNA data. It says what it says, and it says who you are and what you're related to and what you're made up of, and the breeding history of your own family. So why would Central Asian history be so hidden? Well, these people are the biggest criminals in the history of life on this planet. Just look at a history of Russia, and you will see what they did to Russia. It's the Iranians who have ruled and controlled and exploited and just sucked dry every generation the Russian population. And they're going to do it to the whole world if we don't stop them. And I believe that if people want hope, if they want to have a chance to survive, if they want to have a chance of having a decent life, they need to relocate to Russia or China or somewhere in countries that are part of this new multipolar world that Putin and Russia and China are building.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your perspective on this Hiroshima and Nagasaki memorial program in 2015. A very crucial time, and so we want to thank you, Leuren, and we look forward to your joining us again in a future program. Thank you.
I just
Sure.
like to thank you, Alfred, and I just like to apologize one more time to the Japanese, to the souls of the Japanese who died because of the atomic bombing by the U.S. of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I would like to apologize to the world for the crimes of my government in my country. But as people finally realize all over the world as citizens, we have very little influence over our governments. And I want them to remember all governments are terrorist organizations. We don't need them.
Thank you, Leuren.
We're perfectly capable of self-governing. So thank you so much, Alfred, for the many trips we've had together, for the many interviews we've done together, and for persevering today in more government terrorism.
Right. Good. Well,
freedom isn't free.
Right. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.